Okay, welcome back, everyone. We have such great vendors. It's nice to have these breaks. Yes, make sure you visit the free pile at the archives over here because they don't want to take any of that back. All right, we have a real treat here. We have 3 wonderful archivists from the state of South Dakota, various archives, and this session is called Exploring Our Artifacts, and we'll start with Liz Cisar, who will tell us about the Glen E. Soladay collection, the 147th Field Artillery, 1940 to 1945. And Liz comes to us from Augustana University, where she is the collections assistant at the Center for Western Studies. A Minnesota native, she received her BA in history from Augustana in 2006. Most of her archival training has been on the job, but she completed the Western Archives Institute in 2021, which is a really great honor. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all 3 of these speakers, and then they can come one right after the other, kind of like we did with the panel yesterday. So our second speaker is Sam Herley, who is the curator of the South Dakota Oral History Center at the University of South Dakota, and he has been there in that position since 2015. He's served as an instructor at USD for the History Department for Native American Studies program and the Honors program since 2011. And he will be telling us, as I flip through my program here, about the oral history project from World War II veterans and also from veterans of the 60s and 70s. And our last speaker is Matthew Reitzel, who is from the State Archives. And he will be speaking about United We Stand magazines and the Elizabeth Meadow Crissman collection from the summer of 1942. Matthew has served the South Dakota State Archives as the manuscript photo archivist for 17 years. He earned his BA in history in 2001 from Northern State and his MA in history in 2003 from Oklahoma State University. He also compiles a weekly history column for the Pierre Capital Journal. He lives in Pierre with his wife Jessica and daughters Emma and Lily. And Matthew is our go-to guy for many, many things. And we are at the, especially for the journal, but also for all the books at the South Dakota Historical Society Press. So we couldn't survive without him, I think. And I also owe him great debt for putting this panel together, and it was his brainchild, and I think we're going to be the benefits of that inspiration that Matthew had. So, Liz, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. As she said, my name is Liz Cisar, and I'm the collections assistant at the Center for Western Studies. I'll tell you a little bit about the center just to get us started. The center is a program at Augustana University in Sioux Falls dedicated to improving the quality of social and cultural life in the Northern Plains region. And we do this through art exhibitions, historical exhibits, events, book publications, and also our research collections, which include fine and ethnographic art, artifacts, our Krause Library, named after our founder, Herbert Krause, and also the Center for Western Studies archives. Now, it would be terrible for me if I didn't pause here and point out to all of you that in the archives we have many collections related to World War II, and these include oral history interviews, materials related to the Army Air Force's technical school that operated in Sioux Falls during the war and trained some 26,000 servicemen in radio mechanics. And we also have various personal papers collections. But the one I've chosen to focus on today is the Glen E. Soladay collection, depicting his experiences with the 147th Field Artillery Regiment. And I'm going to share it with you in the same way and in the same sequence that I came to know the story. So I'm really hoping that this is going to make sense and you're all going to be able to follow my train of thought here. For me, the story actually begins in 2013 when I was first contacted by Glen's daughter, Liz. She said her father had served in World War II, and in 2008, the family had discovered rolls of undeveloped film in his military footlocker. So they had the film developed, and found themselves holding photos that Glenn's mother, Minnie Soladay, had taken of her son's unit, Battery B of the 147th Field Artillery, mobilizing out of Mitchell, South Dakota. The 147th, consisting of South Dakota National Guardsmen, was called into active service on November 25th, 1940. The men were ordered to report to their home stations, which for Battery B was Mitchell. 10 days later, the regiment mobilized for a cross-country journey to Fort Ord in California for training. And in addition to the Mitchell scenes, the film the family discovered also included photos that Glenn took of this cross-country journey and of the regiment's time in California. So the family's question for me was, would we be interested in these photos for our collection? And that was a pretty easy and quick yes. It was actually a very exciting prospect to get these practically unknown photos of World War II, nearly 70 years old and yet like new, fresh and new photography. We placed a selection of them on exhibit almost immediately. And I called the exhibit Leaving for War, ? Acknowledging that when these men left in December 1940, for what was supposed to be a year of training, they could not have known all that lay in store for them, that they would not be returning to their families, homes, and jobs for more than 4 years, and that some would not return at all. The 147th was sent to Fort Ord in California for a year of training. Performing well, they learned in October of 1941 that they were not returning home, but instead being shipped overseas for a year. On November 22nd, the men boarded the Willard A. Holbrook liner in San Francisco. They stopped briefly at Pearl Harbor and left November 30th. They didn't know where they were going, but eventually they learned that the code word placed on all of their gear, plum, meant the Philippines. Their ship was en route when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, diverting them to land in Australia. Over the next 18 months, they served in several locations throughout Australia, including the city of Darwin, which they defended during a major Japanese raid on February 19th, 1942. Killing nearly 250 people, that raid is described as the largest single attack ever perpetrated in Australia by a foreign power. In 1943, the 147th was sent to New Guinea, and later, certain elements would ultimately make it to the Philippines. And my thanks to the South Dakota Historical Society Press for the map. That map was published in an issue of South Dakota History. But I bring it to show that this here is not likely what those men anticipated when they left South Dakota in 1940. And one of those men was Glenn E. Soladay, better known as Doc Soladay, and that's how I'll refer to him going forward. Doc was born June 21st, 1922, and grew up near Fulton, South Dakota. He graduated from Fulton High School in 1940 and enlisted in the South Dakota National Guard in September of that same year. He shipped out with the 147th in 1941 and was transferred back to the States in July 1945 and was honorably discharged as a master sergeant in August. He brought home with him a case of malaria, but a doctor who had been a missionary in South China recognized the illness and was able to treat him. Returning to Fulton, Doc married Lois Licht in 1949, and the couple had 2 daughters, Liz and Mary, who are actually here with us today. So if there are any questions during the Q&A that I can't answer, I'm really hoping they can help me. Doc worked for his uncle's International Harvester dealership in Fulton for a time before beginning a long career in the Fulton Post Office in 1957. Even after his discharge from the Army, he remained active in the South Dakota National Guard. And in fact, he was part of the Guard units called in to assist with recovery and cleanup following the Black Hills flood of 1972. He retired from the South Dakota National Guard in 1984 and from the Fulton Post Office in 1990. Doc died January 16th, 2013. And the photo albums depicting his unit's mobilization and time in California were donated to the Center for Western Studies later that same year. So unfortunately, I never had the pleasure of meeting him personally. But our story does not end there. The family had many more materials to share, and in fact, Liz was just telling me about some more this morning. What started off as a donation of 3 photo albums has incrementally grown into a collection of some 13 boxes over the past 10 years. And one of the more memorable experiences that I've ever had at the Center for Western Studies was reviewing the contents of his footlocker. And if you look closely, it might be hard to see in this context, but if you look closely, you can see the markings for battery B of the 147FA and the code word plum. The day that I pulled the tattered jockstrap from this footlocker was a particularly interesting one for me. But underneath it was this treasure trove of materials. Doc kept everything, and his footlocker was like a disassembled scrapbook. And as a scrapbooker myself, it was very exciting. There were letters. There were letters to and from his mother, who actually moved to Illinois to work in an ordnance factory during the war. There were letters from his brothers, Robert, who was serving in the Army, and Harold, who was serving in the Navy, and also letters from 2 Australian girlfriends he had while he was overseas. This is actually cut out like that. He cut out the little kissy face and kept that separately. And a sampling of these letters can be read in our digital collections, which are available on np3.augie.edu. There were also diaries and photographs, including additional photographs of his time overseas. But these are some kind of the typical things that you expect to see in a serviceman's papers. What I find most fascinating about this collection, and the reason I chose to focus on it today, is all the other stuff, the ephemera that Doc saved, that I think provides a deeper look into a soldier's daily life. Passes that give some indication of the frequency of his furloughs, and guides for soldiers visiting specific cities. Receipts from the places he shopped and services he engaged. Programs and tickets from entertainments he attended. And with the rest of my time, I'd like to show you a few examples of these items, starting with their experience on the Holbrook liner. So this might be kind of hard to see. I probably should have cropped some more specific details from it, but this is a humorous certificate from the ship's crossing of the equator, in which Neptunus Rex, who is described as monarch of the sea and ruler of the Finny tribes, grants Glenn Soladay the privilege, quote, to swear, drink, and otherwise make a fool of himself, end quote, and to be treated with respect by those who've not crossed into the Southern Hemisphere. And I'm sure it's hard for you to see, but this certificate is dated December 5th, 1941. I imagine the jokes were over when Pearl Harbor was bombed a couple of days later, and the men suddenly found themselves 1,500 miles deep in a hostile ocean. This later memo is dated December 9th and outlines the new lookout station regimen on the ship. We see evidence in his papers of creature comforts. The 2 documents on the left are orders for cases of bottled Coca-Cola. Military personnel consumed more than 5 billion bottles of Coke during the war, many of which came from 64 new bottling plants that the company shipped overseas during the hostilities. There's also in the corner a tobacco ration card, which would have been important not only for personal use, but also as a high-value trade item. We also see evidence of comforts of a different kind as well. Sexually transmitted diseases were a concern for military forces. On the left is a form for prophylactic treatment, filled out while Doc was still stateside. And for contact tracing purposes, which is a concept that we are all very familiar with these days, on the back of this form, the soldier was asked to identify the companion and note whether a friend, a pickup, or a prostitute. On the right is a map and guide to the prophylactic stations available for soldiers in Sydney. And I'll read also from a guide Doc had about furloughs in Melbourne. Quote, "Be choosy about your female companions. There are lots of girls in town. There is no reason to grab the first one who comes along. The pushover almost certainly can infect you. And the type of girl you really like can be met easily in this city," end quote. The final items I'll show you are just a few examples of Japanese propaganda that he brought home with him. This first one shows how a soldier can receive food, cigarettes, and the chance to go home by putting his hands up and surrendering. It has a little flap at the top that you open, and then you can see him surrendering. These last two, the leaflet on the left taunts soldiers that their women are finding other loves back home and having fun without them. And the card on the right speaks from the perspective of one of those women left behind, and she's begging her soldier not to die. On the back of this one are detailed instructions for surrendering. There are many more things I could show you. Matchbooks that he collected from the places he visited. Receipts for having his laundry done by Australian laundresses. His personal copy of Morse code, which he labeled, "Property of Jean Soladay, leave your damn hands off." Unfortunately, we don't have time for more, but I hope you've enjoyed this peek into the archives of Glenn E. Soladay, one of 2,263 South Dakota National Guardsmen to serve in the U.S. Army during World War II, each of whom has their own story to tell. Thank you.
All right, thank you again. My name is Sam Herley. I'm the curator for the South Dakota Oral History Center at the University of South Dakota. So thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. And I also appreciate Matthew for getting in touch with me for this opportunity. And I will confess, my presentation, the way it came out, wasn't exactly the way I had planned when he and I first got in touch. But and so there will be a lot of things to cover. I might go a little fast. I've got some text to go over. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk about those afterwards. So I'll kind of talk quickly about just kind of the background of South Dakota Oral History Center and put up some text here for you. And also I have to thank Jennifer McIntyre, who really did a lot of the heavy lifting at the Oral History Center before I got there in 2015 and made my job so much easier. And also Jessica O'Neill. But the Oral History Center really started in the 1960s through a grant through Doris Duke herself. Not the Doris Duke Foundation, it hadn't really been founded yet, but by Doris Duke herself. She put up her own money because she had an interest in Native American studies. And out of this remarkable, just incredibly prolific oral history project began in South Dakota. And the grant money that she provided went out to 7 universities, Arizona, Florida, Illinois, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Utah, and South Dakota. And so at USD, we are by far the smallest of those universities, and yet we have by far the largest Native American oral history collection stemming from that era, from the 1960s and 1970s. And the project went over well enough that especially Joseph Cash and Herbert T. Hoover, 2 longtime professors there, thought, well, let's see if we can get more funding for this to keep it going, and they got funding from the state legislature in South Dakota to start the South Dakota Oral History Project. And so the AIRP, as we call it, mostly the Native American collection, is now it's over 2,000 interviews. And then the SDOHP, which managed to gather oral histories from every county in the state of South Dakota, is now over 3,400 or 3,500 interviews. So with those and the other collections we have, you're talking about a total of over 6,000 interviews that are at USD, and I like to think it's a very special collection. And we increasingly get patrons from all over, it seems like, and a lot of friends and family, I would say. And I would consider World War II to be our most universal topic of interest, that people of all ages, old, young, I mean students as young as junior high, and regardless of people's background, ethnicity, social status, wherever they come from in the world, across the United States, other countries, this is a really special topic, and I think people really get into it. Occasionally, yes, we get the students who are interested in it as well. So what I have here is just kind of a partial list. I didn't want to put up the whole list, but our staff and our graduate students have really been hard at work kind of documenting and gathering spreadsheets on the items that we have. So this is just the partial list of our World War II oral histories and the AIRP and the SDOHP. And so what you see here are the call number, the name of the interview, the interviewee, the person being interviewed, the interviewer, and then also we've tried to document where there is a transcript and the audio quality graded A through F, essentially A and B being very good. And then also the far column is where it's where we're doing a lot of our work right now. It's the release form and the copyright issues with oral histories. As many of you know, the oral histories are copyright. They're essentially intellectual property. So we have so many interviews that do have a release form, and then we have many that don't. And those that don't are a real problem in oral history centers everywhere, essentially. So we like it if we can get interviews that have those up front, but many don't. And so when they don't, we have to track down the interviewee or their family and see if we can get permission to make copies for our patrons. So I didn't really know where to start. I think I would say that we have, in total, it's fair to say between the AARP and the SDOHP, we have over 150 World War II related interviews. And what I mean by that is not just veterans' experiences, but people who lived through World War II and experienced it in some way. So it could be on the home front, on the farm, commentary on small town life, rationing. And then within that is kind of a smaller minority of interviews where, yes, there are indeed veterans' experiences. But the Great Plains and South Dakota in particular, if you live here, you're not surprised by this, I think. But it's just such a crossroads and an enormous diversity of experiences, people from all walks of life, east and west, ethnicity, class, you name it, religion. And so what we have here, I'm just going to share these kind of quickly in the allotted time. But this is an interview with Frances Sadowski, who was a Jewish woman born around 1910, and she immigrated to South Dakota from Brooklyn to Milwaukee and then to Sioux Falls. And then before the start of World War II, like a lot of South Dakota families, she and her family went to California for a time. And so she was a Jewish woman, and I thought it was interesting, her story kind of connects with some of the comments that were made yesterday with some of the presentations with Japanese Americans. And she has this very poignant story where she talks about going out to parts of California and noting that the Japanese Americans were such good farmers that they would go to roadside vendors and so forth, and the produce from the Japanese vendors was just outstanding, and that's where her family would always like to go. And then one day, for reasons that she didn't understand at the time, she started to notice that these people weren't showing up anymore. And she said it wasn't until years later that she had known what had happened with the internment camps. And this is an example of an interview, I think, where it's a little bit frustrating for me as a historian, because it's frustrating in the questions that aren't asked, because she just touches on this topic. And you kind of wish that the interviewer would kind of ask some more questions, a little bit more elaboration, maybe even comparing and contrasting with her own Jewish experiences. But so she just touches on that, but then also touches on the Jewish experiences in Sioux Falls and the Jewish soldiers Jewish American soldiers that came through the air base there. And this was another interesting interview. We do have a number of interviews with Japanese Americans who immigrated to South Dakota after the war. So Kei Kazuha Hisagawa was a woman who was in an internment camp and came to South Dakota after the war, and goes into quite a bit of detail about the internment camp. And just to touch on this quickly, kind of a story, you just, as archivists, we never quite know who we're going to get as patrons. And so kind of an interesting story, I was talking to Dr. Hackemer about this earlier. In the last couple of years, a woman named Sarah Kay contacted me from New York City and contacted me with this very interesting story about her grandmother, June Suzuki, who, the story just raises so many questions because I don't know how. I didn't really have a good answer for her. But apparently her grandmother, June Suzuki, was in an internment camp, but somehow received government-issued permission to go teach at the School for Native American Girls at St. Mary's in Springfield, South Dakota at some point during the war. And I'd never heard of this kind of thing. So Sarah came and visited. She went to Springfield and talked to people who knew her grandmother there. And she asked if we had any oral histories of her grandmother, and we didn't have an oral history with her grandmother, but we had at least one oral history of one of the school's administrators talking about her grandmother and mentioning her. And so it's raised all kinds of questions. And so Sarah's kind of going into kind of trying to find the paper trail, and I think we helped her a little bit. But these are the kind of things that our archives and our collections seem to touch people from all walks of life. Of all of our interviews that we have in the last, I would say, 6 years or so, this is the one that's gotten the most attention, an interview with John Smith. And so as you kind of notice, some of our interviews, most of them have some kind of what we call a demographic sheet or a data sheet that gives you some information about the person. This is a very special interview. This is an interview, as you can see, with a man named John Smith, and he was a South Dakotan from Mitchell, and he was actually at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and was actually manning an anti-aircraft gun on the USS California when that happened. And so it's a very vivid, rich, detailed experience, account of what that was like to be there in the moment, in the chaos between the bombs and the bullets and torpedoes and everything else. And so you can find an awful lot of interviews about, with people where they talk about where they were when Pearl Harbor happened, but just most people weren't actually at Pearl Harbor when it happened. And so, and it's not like, the U.S. forces that were there, it's not like this was a 100,000-man army in the middle of a months-long campaign. It's a pretty small moment in time and a select group of people. And so in 2016, the Argus Leader contacted us for the 75th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and they said, hey, do you have anything on Pearl Harbor? And I said, funny enough, we do. The only problem is it's not copyright released, and we're searching for the family, and searching for the family of someone named John Smith is very difficult. And so we came up with a plan of action, and the writers were terrific to work with. They did a great story. You can still find it on the internet, and they kind of published a couple quotes from the interview and kind of did some research on John Smith. And sure enough, wouldn't you know it, the family read the article and contacted me, and they were just thrilled. They had no idea that their father they knew that he was at Pearl Harbor. They had no idea that he had done an oral history on this. And so they were more than happy to sign the release form on the right. And so now it is open for all researchers to use. So that's one of our feel-good stories. That's the kind of thing that we love as archivists and historians when that thing kind of happens. First of all, I apologize up front for misspelling the Governor Archie Gobard's last name incorrectly. Just want to get that out of the way. This is a photo of the governor with Ted Blakey. How many of you, did any people here know Ted? Okay, cool. When I was in high school in Yankton many years ago, Ted would come every February and talk to us about Black history. Several of his stories are out in the book by Betty Van Epps Taylor about forgotten lives in South Dakota. And so Ted was just a remarkable person and was born around 1925, and many of his stories, if you've heard him talk or if you've read about him, I mean, his family was one of the first group of black Americans to come up and out of slavery, there's no other way to put it, out of the American South and come to Yankton, South Dakota. And so his accounts are very balanced about what was good in South Dakota, and I think, and sometimes things were not so good, so it's kind of this delicate balancing account of hope and kind of harsh realism is kind of how I would kind of characterize it. And so he talks about the changes that were going on in South Dakota at the time, and I think it's especially important for our students at USD to understand that our students are kind of familiar with, at least nominally, the civil rights movement, and we do have about 35 interviews that talk about the black experience in South Dakota, but most of those talk about the civil rights movement in the 1960s. What's great about Ted's accounts is that he talks about changes that were going on before that kind of predate the civil rights movement proper. And he talks about changes that are going on in Yankton, some positive things, wages and jobs opportunities for black Americans, things that weren't so good, such as continued de facto segregation in parts of the community. But then he also notes at Yankton College at the time that the changes that were going on by the 1940s that you did start to see black Americans start attending Yankton College. So these are important social changes to keep in mind because we think of the civil rights movement, but World War II was so important, affected so many things, including the civil rights movement, opportunities that were going on for different groups of people, and them not wanting to relent those things when the war was over, and then the desegregation of the military and so forth. So we have 3 of Ted's interviews. His family, I'm pleased to say, have opened up his interviews in the last couple years as well. So kind of a breakdown of some things. In the AIRP, we have about 40 interviews from the Native American experiences that talk about World War II. I would say a little less than half of those are veterans' experiences, but those are crucial. I was planning on showing some from Rosebud Reservation, but we're kind of in talks right now with their historical preservation officer about how to present those publicly, so I'm going to hold off on those for now. And William Morrell and Paul Buffalo are 2 prominent names that come up. These were Ojibwe men who were veterans during the war, so I would just mention them. And in the S2HP, there are more than 100 interviews. Again, about 150 total interviews. I haven't looked through them all. I would estimate there's between 100 and 150 hours of recording and possibly up to 3,000 pages of transcription, which we're working on. The majority of these were recorded between 1968 and 1979. The oldest is the John Smith interview done in 1958. The interesting thing about, I think, the recordings at that time is that most of the interviews that were being done with the SDOHP at that time were of elderly people. And of course, World War II veterans mostly were not elderly at that time. And so a lot of the interviews that are done with World War II veterans that we have were done later that really focus on the veterans' experience. A lot of those were done even later in the 90s and 2000s. I would say about 40 of our interviews have women's voices, including about 4 or 5 directly that talk about experiences with the Cadet Nurse Corps, and including one who went on to work as an Army nurse directly, so it's important to have those experiences recorded. Black history, Japanese American history. The Jewish experiences in the Holocaust is interesting because we do have about 30 to 40 Jewish oral histories in the center. But the Holocaust word is very rarely used at the time. The Holocaust word became a Library of Congress keyword in 1968, or a subject term, but it's not used very much. So those experiences can be difficult to find. I suspect, I haven't looked through them all, but I think we do have some that talk about Holocaust survivors or come directly from them. But the descriptions are a little vague. They talk about, us leaving Europe and so forth. So I'll get back to you on more detail on those when I can. But a lot of experiences on the home front, factories, farms, small town life, and so forth, and the changes that were going on. Veterans, oral histories are interesting to me because generally for interviewees, oral histories are not easy to do really for anyone, especially once that recorder goes on, people tend to get self-conscious. I think for veterans in particular, my sense is that they're often reticent, right? They tend to be very humble, especially for this generation, if I could make that generalization. Not just that they maybe saw or did terrible things or whatever, but also I think some are, self-conscious that, I didn't really do anything. I didn't, wasn't awarded the Medal of Honor or Purple Heart. I was just there. But we try to implore them that whatever your experience was, it's important, that the story is worth telling and worth recording. So usually, most of the interviews we have, it's just kind of a tidbit here and there. So many of the interviews that were done in the 60s and 70s are of increasingly elderly people at the time. So a lot of them were born around the turn of the 20th century, and then they kind of talk briefly about what it was like in World War II. But there is this small group of, I would say, of about 20 interviews that specifically discuss veterans' experiences. So our strengths, I think the diversity of the collections is a definite strength, and again, probably unsurprising if you're from South Dakota, but unsurprising if you're from South Dakota. Thanks to Jennifer and Jessica, most of the collection has been digitized into MP3 audio and PDF transcripts, so increasingly we have a global interest in this, which I think is appropriate for World War II. And also the clarity of the audio most of the time is quite good. Some aren't there. We're trying to see what we can do to remaster, repair those. Accessibility, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Other groups, there are some groups that we just don't have. I don't believe, for example, we have any, say, Latino or Mexican American experiences. So there are some groups that are missing. And I would say the clock is ticking, especially with World War II veterans in particular. It's become this very minuscule group, and even people who experience World War II at all. Our window is closing to get those interviews. So, a couple things with accessibility. Almost all of our oral histories are searchable through the USD Online Library Catalog. The digitization has been huge, so you don't have to just call us over the phone or get paper copies. We almost never do paper copies anymore. We can get things to people right over the internet. And I would mention the Digital Library of South Dakota, who we work with regularly. We're continuing to upload oral histories to that repository. So we have about 30 to 35 World War II related interviews that you can just go and click on. It's free of charge. You can just listen to those interviews. And as I tell people, there's nothing quite like the power of the human voice. So to hear the recording is pretty awesome. And sometimes, especially for people who are connected to these people, or our grandparents, parents, great-grandparents at this point, it can be a pretty emotional experience to hear those. Audio and audio quality issues, as I mentioned. Transcription, which we're working on, and the transcription software is getting better all the time. I would say about half have what I would consider to be quality transcripts at this time. And this copyright release form status is something that we're working on all the time as well. And the internet helps. People have never been more connected, so that's good, but it's still a lot of work. And we're also continuing to gather the stories. There have been so many local oral history projects related to World War II in the last 10, 15, 20 years. In Yankton County, Doug Haar and Dave Hosmer, just one example, have collected over 100 interviews, including video recordings of these veterans, which has been awesome to see. And student oral history projects, so I have a quick kind of a personal story that I wanted to share. I wanted to mention Amanda Haas in particular. So this happened just last week, almost to the hour. Today, it would have been, just before Easter. So the gentleman on the left wearing the blue shirt is my stepdad, Jim Black, and he's a World War II veteran. And he, for several years now, is believed to be the last living World War II submarine veteran still living in the state of South Dakota. And he lives in Yankton. And so the American Legion surprised him Saturday last week with this award recognizing him for 78 years in the American Legion. So Jim turned 98 in January. And this is kind of a neat moment. And so his father, Everett, was a World War I veteran and was very proud of his American Legion status. And so Everett, as soon as Jim joined the Navy, Everett signed him up for the American Legion. So 78 years in the American Legion. And so I sometimes talk to instructors at USD about oral history projects, especially Dr. Jing Williams has done tremendous work. And I was giving a presentation afterwards. One of the students came up, Amanda Haas, and said, could I interview your stepdad? I said, sure, I think that could be arranged. And so she did a great job with the interview and won an award at USD for undergraduate research excellence. And so we're very proud of that. And if I could just share one part of the interview, what I really liked is she captured one of my favorite stories about Jim. And by the way, when I met Jim, I first met him in 1983, and back then he was just a kid. So, as you might imagine, but he's still very sharp and has, a lot of memories that he can still tell. And so, he was in the last couple months of the war, he was the log keeper for the USS Silversides, which is the most decorated American submarine still in existence. It sunk 23 ships during the war, and it's still docked up in Michigan. You can still visit it. I would encourage you to do that unless you have even a smidgen of claustrophobia. He was the log keeper. He says that he had an office on board the sub that was about the size of a telephone booth and a little typewriter. I think he's being generous. Having seen it myself, I'd say it's about half the size of a telephone booth. But, so he was the log keeper on the submarine, and so he was serving on the U.S. Silversides when at the age of 21. He'd just been recently married, and his wife was pregnant with their first child. And here he was. They were stationed at Guam in August 1945. That's where they were docked at the time. And that's where they were on August 15th when the announcement was made of the Japanese surrender. The signing of the surrender hadn't happened yet, but it was announced. And so he talks about what that was like in this interview. And he has this wonderful story about this moment, how here he is in this midst of sailors celebrating and everything's going on. And here he is in the midst of it. And this kind of surreal moment where he looks over in this vast celebration. He looks over and here's this great big sign that says, Wall Drug, South Dakota, 6,000 miles away. So we're happy that he's still around and able to tell these stories. So, and I would just mention, I thought it was interesting. I just saw this recently that that our South Dakota we're the second state to be under 500 World War II veterans left. So we're not the smallest state by population, but we just don't have very many left at all. So if you get a chance to talk to one, by all means do so if you can. And if they're willing, by all means, use a recorder as well. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them afterwards. And thanks for talking with me all so far. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking my fellow archivists who came here today. We appreciate that. We've started a South Dakota archivist group. So if you are an archivist, if you know someone who is an archivist, if you are an archivist on Thursdays, give us a contact, I guess, and we can put you in our group. I'd also like to thank the Soladays who I got to saw today. When Liz sent her title, I guess, for her program, I saw Glenn Soladay, and I was like, whatever. And then, of course, my mother called me, and she said, that's Doc Soladay. And I was like, oh, Doc Soladay, yes. I knew the Soladays from my church. Lois was a Sunday school teacher of mine, so, yeah, it all made sense once I got a call from my mother. So thank you for that. So my name is Matthew Reitzel. I'm the manuscript archivist with the South Dakota State Archives, a program of the South Dakota State Historical Society. This presentation will highlight the United We Stand magazine covers from the summer of 1942, collected by Ipswich native Elizabeth Crissman, which are currently held in the collections of the South Dakota State Archives, located at the Cultural Heritage Center in Pierre. My plan this morning is to introduce you to the United We Stand campaign, tell you a little bit about Elizabeth Crissman and her scrapbooks, and present some of the United We Stand magazine covers found within the collection. So all the magazines you'll see here in this presentation are from Elizabeth's collection. So, in the summer of 1942, the United States and much of the world is at war. Summer of 1942 was roughly 7 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and it would be the first 4th of July since the start of the war. The United We Stand campaign was a joint effort between the National Publishers Association and the United States Treasury Department. As you look through these magazines, as we go through them, on this one here, you'll see the United We Stand is kind of towards the bottom, and then just at the bottom of the flagpole, there's a little square. That's the war bond promotional sticker, which you'll see as we go through these. The goal of the United We Stand campaign was to promote patriotism on the home front and also to sell magazines and war bonds. Their plan was to have as many magazine covers with the American flag on them as they possibly could. The United States Flag Association also joined in the effort by giving awards to specific magazine covers. The most outstanding overall cover was given to House and Garden magazine, which you see here, showing an American flag above George Washington's Mount Vernon. Other awards included the Cross of Honor and Patriotic Service Cross. The awards were given to the best painting and photograph used on a cover, as well as best monthly and weekly magazines. Elizabeth's scrapbooks includes some of the United States Flag Association winners. So Elizabeth Crissman was a native of Ipswich, South Dakota. She was a Red Cross district treasurer during World War II. In 1983, during Ipswich's centennial, Elizabeth was named historian of the centennial, and the Ipswich Centennial book was dedicated to her. So she obviously was a well-known local historian in the Ipswich area. In the summer of 1942, Elizabeth made a trip to Chicago shortly before the 4th of July and had seen all of the various patriotic magazine covers on newsstands as she traveled throughout the city. She returned to Ipswich and decided to collect as many magazine covers as possible. As she noted in her scrapbook, quote, "I have a new hobby which was born of the war. In total, there are 232 individual magazine covers within the 3 scrapbooks she created, and they were donated to the State Archives in 2005. Elizabeth provided a few notes concerning her new hobby, and she also created an index to the magazine collection. She also listed where the magazines came from. Some of the magazines belonged to either her or her husband. Those marked as agency, she requested directly from the publishers. And in several instances, Ipswich family members, neighbors, and acquaintances provided many magazine covers for Elizabeth's collection. So on that list, on the right up there, some of the names are Ruth Cronholm, Ada Wolster, Paul Bird, Donald Engler, Lil Wetz. So it's almost kind of a list of people from Ipswich that she knew who gave her these magazines. So when I was putting this presentation together, I decided I needed to say that scale was important when we're looking at these. Some magazines were large, some were small, but they kind of all look the same when you're making a PowerPoint presentation. So I just wanted to make that clear when we're looking through these. And I'd also like to extend a special thank you to our archives volunteer, Britta Brusven, who scanned these scrapbook pages for us. As I mentioned earlier, in some instances, Elizabeth provided notes for the magazine, which generally were the text within the magazine that explained what you were looking at. Like in the Coronet magazine, the woman here on the right was born on the 4th of July, so that was the story about her and why she was on the cover. So now I'm just going to go through some of the magazines. Like I said, there's 232, so we can't go through all of them, I guess, but there's a few here that I was able to pick out. There's the American Druggist, the American Hairdresser, and American Restaurant magazine. When Elizabeth got all these, she must have got them and said, I have enough now, and then put them all together in her scrapbook because they are in alphabetical order as you go through these. And again, a wide variety of topics: druggists, hairdressers, restaurants, and then the middle one for the American hairdresser has this one saying, which I liked, which said, "Be the woman behind the man behind the gun." So. And then you also have the various popular magazines, Cosmopolitan, Life, and Time magazines. And Time magazine was one of the winners of the U.S. Newspaper Association Awards. And then there were a number of organizations that also participated as well. There's the Elks magazine, Kiwanis, and Modern Woodman. And you can't see it from here, but in the Elks magazine, kind of at the bottom right, there's a mailing label there, and that reads F.E. Lass from Ipswich. So again, another person who had a magazine, knew Elizabeth was collecting them, and gave them to her. On very rare occasions, some of the magazines collected included the back cover of the magazine. This is Northwestern Bell magazine, which included the 207 in armed forces who worked with Northwestern Bell. And again, on the very top of this one, there's another mailing label, which was from the Ipswich State Bank. So another person who knows she's collecting stuff. Okay, so a phrase a lot of us have been saying lately is, during COVID, okay, so during COVID, we had a lot of people going to our website, South Dakota Digital Archives, our Archive Space website, and looking through the collections that we have. And I was contacted by a Dr. Steve Lemaizo, MD, who is a collector of magazines. He also collects a number of United We Stand magazines, so we were able to have Zoom meetings and meet with other magazine folks and just talk about these collections and talk about the collections that we have. So some of the things that he kind of mentioned in our conversation, if you look at the left there, it's National Geographic magazine. The United We Stand campaign, this was the first time that a graphic was used on National Geographic. Usually it's just the yellow border and kind of the frame and the words in the middle. So this was the first time that they used the graphic. It was the flag. There's the GIA magazine, which is in the middle, and I'm pretty certain that was Steve's favorite magazine. He talked about it a lot. A couple weeks ago, I got in touch with him again, and he left a message on my phone, and he was like, "Oh yeah, and there's that magazine. Yeah, that was his favorite." And it's the American Industry Importer's Guide. And again, just another one that he enjoyed. And then the Winged Foot is the magazine for the New York Athletic Club. So I think Steve was just kind of impressed at the reach that she was getting with some of these magazines in her collection. As I noted, there's a couple of interesting sayings on these magazines. There's Astrology Guide, which says the Axis can't win. And for you naysayers out there, Astrology Guide was correct. So the Axis did not win. So there's Moneymaker, we can, we must, we will win. And then on the far right is Today's Home magazine, which includes some sayings that I think fit perfectly for the time. Sweets on a ration card, lunches for war workers, and my personal favorite, keep charming for morale. So, and then, of course, they're trying to get people of all ages. So we have some comic books here, Magic Comics, Foremost Comics, and True Comics. And then we get a little bit older for teens, boys and girls. There's Boys Life, Calling All Girls, and The Open Road for boys. And then I think this is something I maybe wouldn't have noticed if we hadn't scanned these. It's kind of hard to look through 3 different scrapbooks all at the same time, but when you see them on a computer screen, you start to realize, oh, this is the same image, and it's because they were all published by the Street and Smith Publication Company out of New York, so they're all using the similar graphics, but the magazines here are Astounding Science Fiction, Detective Story Magazine, and Sports Story Magazine. And this is just another slide just showing the diverse topics again. There's the Flower Grower, Minicam Photography, and The Quill. And The Quill is a magazine for writers, editors, and publishers. Geyer's Topics is the Office Equipment and Stationery Dealers magazine, for those who are interested. Hoard's Dairyman, again, is published Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. And then The Insurance Salesman, which is another magazine she's able to find. And of course, Hollywood has to get involved with such programs. So there's the Screen Guide, Screenland, and Silver Screen magazines. And going here from left to right, there's Betty Grable, Veronica Lake, and Dorothy Lamour. And then we go from Hollywood to religion. There's the Christian Herald, The Sign, which is the National Catholic magazine, and then also the Young Crusader. This was another Steve LeMazo shout out here. This is the children's magazine for Women's Christian Temperance Union. So that's their children's magazine. As well as magazines, there was also newspapers as well that were involved with this. It's Wallace's Farmer and Iowa Homestead, the Michigan Farmer and the Montana Farmer, and both the Michigan and Montana farmers came from the North Dakota Agricultural College in Fargo. So these are just interesting magazines that start with the letter D. So we have Daring Detective. And in Daring Detective's defense, there is a flag up on the top right, and it does say United We Stand. So they were participating. And if someone can find me a copy of Slain Wife and the Attic Crematory, I would like to read that. So. And then there's also Dog News and The Downbeat. And then here we have True Story, True Romance, True Love, and Romance. So. And I think the last two are probably from the same publishing company again because they look very similar. Hopefully the stories were different, I guess, as you read through them. And then we end here with Hat Life, which has, I like their back cover more than their front, actually. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, thank you all. Are there any questions? All right, well, thank you very much to our speakers. As I've said before, feel free to go up to them and talk to them during our vendor break. And please visit our vendors. We're almost running out of time to talk to them as well. So thank you, and we'll see you after the break.